So apparently, the First Minister couldn't bear to watch the SNP leaders' debate this week. But her ears must have been burning as the candidates torched her record in government. Now, I like to be helpful to the First Minister, so let me recap some of the things that were said. I'm quite happy to continue if you are, Presiding Officer.
If you're content to
I'm very happy
Mr.
to continue.
Ross,
they can ignore them while I direct my comments to the First Minister. So let's be absolutely clear. I can be helpful to the First Minister if people can hear, but maybe we can't, Presiding Officer. So we've tried. We have tried,
Mr. Ross. We will suspend briefly. Thank you. We will resume. Please begin at the beginning, Mr. Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. John Swinney and Nicola Sturgeon seem to be enjoying the start of my question, so I think I'll repeat it, because I was just saying, apparently the First Minister couldn't bear to watch this week's SNP leaders' debate, but her ears must have been burning as the candidates torched the SNP's record in government. So let me be helpful to Nicola Sturgeon, as I tried to do, and update her on what was said. Her Finance Secretary, Kate Forbes, said this about Scotland. The trains never run on time, the police service is stretched to breaking point, there's record high waiting times in the NHS. Does the First Minister applaud, as we do on this side of the chamber, her Finance Secretary's honest assessment of this SNP's record in government?
First Minister.
Well, of course, I didn't unfortunately catch the leaders' debate the other night because I was on my way back from a wonderful visit to the inspirational Glasgow Women's Library, a fabulous place that I would recommend to anybody across the chamber. And, Presiding Officer, for my part, of course, the only verdict on my government that really matters is the verdict from the people we serve, the people of Scotland. And that verdict has been pretty clear over the 8 years of my leadership, winning no fewer than 8 elections. And let me perhaps remind Douglas Ross, trying as I always do to be helpful to him, why that might be the case. Because under this government, we've seen a 20% increase in NHS staff, the highest number of doctors and nurses proportionately anywhere in the UK. We've seen a doubling of the NHS budget. We've seen the best performing A&Es anywhere in the UK for the last 7 years, the only part of the UK with no NHS strikes and the highest paid workforce anywhere on these islands. A significant reduction in hospital infections, £10,000 nurse bursaries at a time when the Tories in England scrapped nurse bursaries, scrap prescription charges, take away parking charges at NHS hospitals, leading the way on public health measures. Presiding Officer, I can see you're looking at me askance. That's just the NHS. I look forward to getting on to other topics later in this session.
Douglas Ross.
Well, if the First Minister really did miss the first TV debate, there's another one tonight. I'm just really worried that 30 minutes isn't going to be long enough for the candidates to trash her record in government. Now, last week I said there seems to be 2 Kate Forbes, one with a terrible record in government and one who says this government has a terrible record. But now the Finance Secretary's in an even bigger guddle. She can't decide if she's in government or she's in opposition. Just listen to that statement from Kate Forbes again. The current Finance Secretary said that the current SNP government leaves trains that never run on time, the police service stretched to breaking point and record high waiting times in our NHS. That's a quote sorted for every Scottish Conservative leaflet going forward. And there's even more material that we can use. Kate Forbes said, more of the same is not a manifesto, it's an acceptance of mediocrity. The First Minister might expect to hear that from me, but did she really expect to hear that from her own Finance Secretary?
First Minister.
Well, you see, Presiding Officer, I am very, very aware that for Douglas Ross, mediocrity, of course, is a dizzy height that he's never come close to achieving. There's also...
Thank you.
There's no confusion whatsoever about where Douglas Ross is in terms of government or opposition. He's in opposition now, and he's going to remain in opposition for a long, long time to come. But helpfully, and he has been very helpful today, I'm most appreciative, he's taken me into other subject matters. So briefly, Presiding Officer, he talked about crime. So let's talk about the record of my government, endorsed 8 times in 8 years under my leadership by the Scottish people. Crime down by more than 48%. Violent crime alone down by 48%. Automatic early release
Excuse me,
ended.
First Minister. Let's have one speaker at a time, please. First Minister.
Automatic early release ended, of course opposed by the Scottish Conservatives. We see re-offending rates amongst the lowest ever, the highest number of police officers than any time during previous Scottish administrations, higher proportionately than any other part of the UK, strengthened the law on domestic abuse. And then there's transport, ScotRail in public ownership, lower fares on average than where the Tories are in power, £11 billion of investment in rail infrastructure. The M74 completed, the Aberdeen bypass built, the Queensferry crossing built, the highest investment in active travel of any UK nation. I could go on, Presiding Officer, and I'm happy to do so later on.
Douglas Ross.
Well, if the First Minister did continue that record in government on transport, it would be the A9 delayed, the A96 delayed, ferries that are rusting in the docks, not serving the island communities that they're there for. But the First Minister seems to think if she doesn't mention Kate Forbes, if she pretends she didn't watch it, these comments didn't occur. This was a Scottish Government Minister, someone currently serving under Nicola Sturgeon, tearing apart this record in government. And if Nicola Sturgeon won't focus on Kate Forbes, we know that one of her closest allies will. Shona Robeson, a current Cabinet colleague of Kate Forbes, said that Kate Forbes is trashing the record of the SNP government. But Kate Forbes has voted for every single SNP policy. She's backed every single SNP referendum demand and every one of the SNP budgets. She's the Finance Secretary. She writes the budgets. And Kate Forbes was Nicola Sturgeon's right-hand woman, handpicked by the First Minister to rise rapidly up through the ranks. When promoting Kate Forbes in February 2020, the First Minister said this in the Chamber: Kate Forbes has a forensic grasp of detail. On this government's record, she's got the detail bang on the money, hasn't she?
First Minister.
Well, of course, all three of those colleagues of mine vying to be my successor, vying to have the joy of First Minister's questions every Thursday at 12 o'clock, all of them either are or have been members of my government. So, of course, they all share in the success of the government that I am proud to lead. Now, I am, of course, by my own choice now an outgoing leader, but I want to be serious for a minute here. Nobody needs a running commentary from me. Certainly nobody needs a running commentary from Douglas Ross on anything, but that is another matter. Nobody needs a running commentary from me, but if I was to offer advice, firstly to those vying to succeed me, it would be this. Of course, the internal process is really important. But while it might not feel it right now, it is actually the relatively easy part. Being First Minister is hard, it's tough, it is a massive responsibility. And whoever emerges in the position of First Minister and is standing here 3 weeks today has one overriding task, Presiding Officer. It is to govern and it is to serve in a way that inspires the people of Scotland to keep placing trust in us, just as they have done consistently since 2007 and just as they have done 8 times over the 8 years of my leadership. That's what matters, because without that trust, nothing else is possible. And finally, to my opponents, perhaps a word to the wise. as well. I can't grudge you watching the first SNP leadership election in 20 years, because we've had lots of Tory and Labour leaderships to enjoy over these years. But here's that word to the wise. For as long as you are using virtually all of your airtime in talking about the SNP, because you have nothing positive to offer, then fundamentally the problem is not ours, Presiding Officer. The problem is yours, because you're destined to stay exactly where you are right now, in opposition.
Douglas Ross.
If only the SNP candidates had something positive to offer rather than fighting with each other. But Kate Forbes has been so honest about the SNP's record in government that just this morning, Mary Black, the SNP's Deputy Westminster leader, said the SNP could split over this contest. Nicola Sturgeon has divided Scotland, and now her departure is dividing the SNP. Yet, while the SNP go through this civil war, the real priorities of Scotland are being ignored. This divided and distracted party is failing to give Scots the health service they deserve. Well, the current Health Secretary is mumbling while I'm speaking about his portfolio area. So let's go through what has been said this week. BMA Scotland told us that nearly half of junior doctors are thinking of quitting. On Monday, an investigation reported 1 in 5 people in Scotland have been forced to go private for health treatment. There are 773,000 Scots on an NHS waiting list just now. And 10 patients a month are travelling to Lithuania for treatment. Travelling from Scotland to Lithuania for treatment. So, First Minister, when you said people should focus on governing and serving, shouldn't the SNP leadership candidates focus on the crisis in our NHS, not the crisis in their party?
First Minister.
Let me come on to the NHS in a second. But, you know, every single one of the SNP politicians that has been mentioned by Douglas Ross today has more popular and public approval than he does. Douglas Ross, I think, is the least popular elected leader in Scotland today. So my advice to him was intended to be helpful. Perhaps if he spent a bit more time looking in the mirror and reflecting on the reasons for his party's and his personal unpopularity, and a bit less time thinking about the SNP, he might not be in the dire straits he's in right now. And in terms of the NHS, of course our NHS faces significant challenges, but of course the numbers self-funding private care in Scotland are lower, significantly lower than they are in Tory-run England or indeed Labour-run Wales. We are now seeing reductions, considerable reductions, whether it's in outpatients or inpatients, in the longest waits, because we are focusing on NHS recovery. And it's because we're focusing on NHS recovery that no NHS workers have been forced onto strike action in Scotland, and in fact, in terms of agenda for change, the highest paid workers anywhere in the UK. That's the focus on the NHS we have and will continue to have for as long as we're in government.
Question number 2.